Hey, what is up guys? Welcome back to another Java tutorial, and in this video we are going to be covering arrays and loops. I told you I was going to make this video about loops, and here we are. But we're also going to cover arrays, because arrays and loops are very closely related, for the simple fact of if you want to go through an array of items, you can use a loop to go through each and every item and figure out what they are, get the index of them, that kind of stuff. I'm going to show you all of that in this tutorial. So, first off, let's talk about arrays. What are arrays? Well, arrays are essentially containers. They're objects that contain different values. You can create arrays out of almost anything, whether it be objects, integers, strings, all kinds of stuff. And there's multiple ways to define an array, both of which I will show you in this video. So, let's get started, shall we? First things first is, let's kind of go over the syntax. In order to create an array, you first have to give it, you have to go ahead and give it a type. In this case, we're going to make it an array of integer values. So, int. And then after our initial type, we give it an opening and closing square bracket. This tells Java, hey, this is an array, treat it as a container that contains multiple values. Then we give it a name. I'm going to call it sum ints. And we're going to set it equal to new int, and then opening and closing square brackets, and semicolon at the end. Now, inside of this set of square brackets here at the end, we need to tell it how many values we want to contain in this, how many values we want this array to hold. So let's say we just want it to hold 10 integers. So put that in there, and that's our array. Now, the new keyword is interesting. The new keyword basically says, okay, we need to create a new object or a new array here. You'll find new being used whenever we create objects. Again, you will learn what an object is in more detail later on. But just know, new in this context is creating a new integer array, or a new array, however you want to view it. So, with that being said, right now we don't have anything inside of this array. It's empty right now. How do we add values to this array? Well, we have to reference specific spots in the array using what's called an index. An index is assigned each chunk in memory that this array has is assigned an index, and this index always starts at 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. In our case. However, if we had, say, an array with 100 items, the index would go from 0 to 99, so on and so forth. This is something very important to keep in mind, because people make this mistake all the time. People will often go and forget that an array starts at 0 index, and they'll start at 1, and then they'll try to access say index 10 in an array that only has 10 items, and they'll get an error because they tried to access an index that doesn't exist. So how do we reference this index then? Well, we can go sum ints, and then we reference it using our square brackets. And inside of the square brackets, we give the index value. So in this case, index 0, which is our first index. And then we assign a value to this chunk of memory. So let's say we assign it 10. And we can do this for each and every item in our array. So we'll just get all these values here squared away. So there we go. And then we change our indexes. So again, arrays start at index 1. Well, they start index 0, I'm sorry. And then we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 is our final index in this array. And so now, let's try to print this. What do you think is going to happen when we print this? Well, let's go ahead and print some ints. We'll save it. And then we will run it and see what happens. You can see we get this really weird looking thing down here with an opening square bracket, uppercase I at 15DB9742. What is that? Well, that's what we call a hash code. And a hash code is basically a memory address. It's where the array is in memory. This will happen when you print out an object, like an array by default. So if we want to see all the elements in the array inside of one print statement, what we want to do is we want to use what's called the arrays class. And we can do that by import java.util.arrays. Well, okay, so what I'll do instead is I'll go arrays dot. Okay, so we'll go arrays, and then inside of here we put some ints like that. Dot to string like that. Okay, so we have that. And we do Control-Shift-O to import java.util.arrays, like I said before. But Eclipse was being kind of funky. Okay. With that, we can go ahead and save this and run it. Okay. Save that. And now you can see we get 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Inside of an array. Inside the console. Pretty neat. So if you ever need to preview what elements are in your array, you can do that. Now, there are other ways that we can assign values to our array. So if we go ahead and just delete all of this code, and we go and remove new int, so on and so forth. After the equal sign, what you can do here is put in some curly braces, and then inside of these curly braces, give it the values that you want to have inside of the array. So in this case, we would say 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And this can be, this can go on and on forever if you really wanted it to. So I can go ahead and just grab all of these and copy them, say, 2 times. So now we have 30 items in our array, all with basically similar values. So with that, we can go system out println, and we go arrays.toString, and then inside of here we go some ints, just like that. Now, of course, we can. We're gonna go ahead and go back over our code here, and I've had an extra comma at the end there. Right. So we have that now. Let's go ahead and save this and run our code. You can see we got an error. Now what does it say? Exception in thread main, java.lang.error, unexpected compilation problem, syntax error, insert semicolon to complete statement. So this is a good opportunity for you guys to debug the code here. What did we forget? Where did we forget our semicolon? Well, we forgot our semicolon at the end of the print statement. So go ahead and do that. Now we get all of our syntax highlighting. And we can go ahead and run this again. And we get our array output. Now that's all fine and dandy, but what if we want to output these items individually, one by one? Well, that's where loops come in. The first kind of loop I'm going to talk to you about is a loop called a for loop. So, what exactly is a for loop? Well, a for loop is something that we refer to as a counter loop. It has a counter that we initialize, we test, and then we increment or decrement depending on your use case. You can do the same thing with another loop called a while loop. However, a while loop is usually used only to loop until a certain condition is met. It doesn't say, oh, loop this amount of times, so on and so forth. And then we've also got another loop called a do while loop. And what that loop does is it basically runs code once, then tests to see whether or not a condition is true. If it's true, it goes through again. If it's not, it doesn't go through again. That's what we call a post-test loop, because it tests the condition after the code is run at least once. So let's go ahead and demonstrate those kinds of loops. So first things first is we're going to look at the for loop. So how do we create a for loop? Well, we need to go for, the keyword for, and then have parentheses and curly braces. Inside of these parentheses, this is where we do our initialization, our testing, and our increment or decrement. So in this case, we're just going to do a normal increment. You can experiment with decrementing or that kind of thing with the increment and decrement operators that I showed you in the previous videos. So first things first is to initialize our counter. So int, typically you'll find this called I, so that's what we'll do here. Int I, set it to an initial value of 0. This can be, you can do this a few different ways as well. You can basically say, hey, I want you to start counting at this specific point in the array rather than just the beginning or just the end. You can start it in the middle if you really wanted to. But in this case, we're going to start at the beginning with index 0. And we want this loop to keep going with this test. So we want the loop to make this test I is less than. Now here's a little bit of a dilemma. Right now we know that our array is 30 elements in length, and that's fine. So we could just hard code 30 here and call it a day. But in most professional applications, you're not going to know how long the array will be, because sometimes you need to get data from a web server somewhere. And you're not going to know how many items in an array, how many items that's going to bring back. So that is what the length property of an array is for. How do we refer to that? Well, we go sum ints dot length. This gets whatever this gets how long the array is. So we'll do that. And then we increment or decrement. In this case, we want to increment by 1. So we'll say I plus plus. You could do I plus equals 2, I plus equals 3, so on and so on. You do minus, minus equals 2, minus equals 3, whatever. As long as you're incrementing or decrementing the value, because if you decide, oh, let's not do that, the loop is gonna give you an error, and it's just not gonna be fun for you, right? Or you could even just do plus equals 0, in which case this wouldn't throw an error, but you would have an infinite loop, and you don't want to have an infinite loop because you don't want your computer to blow up. Not literally, but figuratively. So we're going to just say plus plus here. And inside of the body of this loop, we want to put code that we want to execute. So in this case, we want to system out print line, and then here we're going to use a concept called concatenation, where we want to add a string we want to put values inside of a string to print out here, and we do that with a plus sign to add to a string. I'll show you how you do that. So we'll say item at index, well, item, and we'll say plus right after that. And then we'll say I plus 1, because remember, I starts at 0, so if we want the actual item number that it is in our actual counting where we start at 1, we have to add 1 to that. This isn't going to affect the counter value as it goes through the loop. Just keep that in mind. And so we're actually also gonna surround these with parentheses, so that way it evaluates that first and treats it as one whole value. And we say plus, and then we go ahead and do a string again, space at index, and then here we just give it I plus again is, and then here's where we have a little bit of an interesting thing. We now need to reference the value at the given index, which, as I showed you before, we go sum ints, and then inside of square brackets, we're just going to give this I, because I is the index that we want to reference. So with that, we can go ahead and save this and run it. And now here we are inside of the console. You can see item 1 at index 0 is 10, and it just keeps going until we reach the 30th item in our array. And with this, we can output all the different items in the array just fine. Now, there is another way of doing this where we don't have to do all of this string concatenation. We can use what's called a format. So we can use system.out.printf, and what this will do is it will use certain formatting characters to say, hey, this is a placeholder for a value inside of this string, and we're going to pass you this value later on. So how does that work? Well, we can go system out printf, right? So you can see here, this takes in two different things. This takes in our arguments that we want to pass to our placeholders and the format string. So in here, we're going to say item, and then in order to put a placeholder for a number, we say %d. So item 0, or item 1, item 2, so on and so forth, at index, another number, so that will be %d as well, is, and then again, this will be a d because it's also a digit. And then after this string, we do a comma, and then this is where we put all the values that we want to put inside of these placeholders one by one. So the first one, item number, is I plus 1. The second is just the index, so I. And then third is whatever the value is at the given index. So sum ints I. Just like that. And then also for good measure, I'm going to add a new line I'll teach you what those are in the next video, but just to show you that that this does in fact work, we're gonna save it and run this. You can see again we get the same output that we had last time. Pretty cool. So that's one way of doing a for loop and a more efficient way of printing out all the items to the console. Another way of doing a for loop is what's called a for each loop. And how do we do that? Well, we do for, and then again our parentheses and our curly braces. But inside of these parentheses, we do something a little bit different. We go int, and then we'll say sum int, and then we do a colon, and then we give our collection or array or whatever that we want to loop through. So sum ints. Now what is this saying? Well, this says for every integer inside of our sum ints array, we want to do something with it. This doesn't give us an index or anything like that. If we're using this and we want an index, we have to define a counter ourselves and then increment it every time we print out something or do whatever it is that we need to do inside of our loop. So, but even at that point, you're better off just using the counter for a loop as it is. So all we're going to do here is just run a system out print line and sum int. Right, just like that. Let's save this and run it. And you can see we get all of our values printed to the console. Pretty neat. Right? So, those are the for loops. What about a while loop? We can loop through our stuff inside of our array with a while loop as well. And so, how do we do that? Well, we do while, and then our parentheses and our curly brackets. And inside of the parentheses, this is where our condition goes. So we're going to say while counter is less than sum int dot length, we want to do something. Now, where's counter at? Well, we haven't defined it yet. So let's define it. Int counter, we're going to set this initially equal. Let's go backwards this time. So I'm going to set this initially to sum ints dot length. Well, even then -1, so that way we get a valid index, because again, we start counting at 0, and we have 30, so 29 is our last index. Right? So with this, what we do then is we want to say while counter is greater than or equal to 0. And so with that, we can go ahead and put system out printf. Here we put our format, and then we give our arguments. So item %d at index %d is %d for the new line, And here we say counter plus 1 counter and then some ints and a reference counter as our index. Like that. Perfect. So this is our while loop. However, we're forgetting one thing. Go ahead and go on a new line. Now we need to decrement our counter, because if we don't, counter is always going to be 30, or well, 29, I should say. And counter being, counter greater than or equal to 0 will always continuously be met. It will never return false. So counter minus minus. And with that, we can run that and save it. And as you see here, we start at item 30, and it just goes all the way down. Now we can do this, we can do the same thing with a do while loop. So if we look at our while loop, this should be very easily translatable. First thing, when a do while loop is the do keyword, and then we have our opening and closing curly brackets. Then we open those up. Outside of the closing curly bracket, we do a while, and then inside of those parentheses we put our condition and a semicolon afterward. So we'll say while counter is greater than or equal to 0, we want to do something. And so we can just copy paste this code paste it in. Oh, okay, so I screwed something up. It's looking like. So we will do that. There we go. Just like that. Okay. Then inside the do while loop, we put that. So now, if we save this, and we run this, you can see we get the same result. However, the only difference is that the code inside the do block is executed once, and then the condition gets tested, and then if it returns true, it keeps going. If it returns false, it drops out of the loop. Pretty cool, right? These are the different ways that you can loop through an array and the different ways that you can define an array. If you really want to as well, you can have the int sum ints equals new int, and then we define the number of elements that we want in the array. What you can do is you can also use a loop to give it values based on a counter inside of your for loop, instead of having to go and assign the values manually line by line. I'll leave that up to you guys to figure out how to do, but it should be fairly simple for you guys. Yeah, that basically does it for this video on loops. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys learned something. If you still don't understand it, feel free to leave a question down in the comments below. I will get back to you as soon as possible to answer those questions for you. And yeah, so thank you all so very much for watching. We'll see you in the next one. See ya.